Hey guys. Settle here. Tonight we are going to start the dark psychology of ancient Egyptian power. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Ancient Egypt did not begin with pyramids. It began with fear. Not the loud kind. Not the fear of invasion or famine. But the quiet, psychological fear of chaos. The Egyptians had a word for order. Ma'at. And it was more than balance. It was the fragile idea that the universe itself could fall apart at any moment. The Nile could fail. The sky could collapse. The dead could refuse to stay dead. And in the center of all this stood one human being. The pharaoh. Not just a king. Not just a ruler. But the living barrier between existence and collapse. And that belief, that single psychological structure, shaped one of the most powerful civilizations in human history. Because when you convince a population that one man is the spine of reality, disobedience stops being political. It becomes cosmic treason. From the very beginning, Egyptian power was never merely administrative. It was existential. The pharaoh was not chosen by the gods. He was the gods. Or at least, that is what the system insisted. This wasn't symbolic in the way modern societies use symbolism. It was literal. If the pharaoh weakened, the Nile might not rise. If the pharaoh sinned, the harvest might fail. If the pharaoh died improperly, the entire afterlife structure could destabilize. So power in Egypt was not about policy. It was about psychological containment. Contain chaos. Contain doubt. Contain death. And the most brilliant part? The pharaoh himself had to believe it too. Imagine growing up as a royal child in Thebes or Memphis. From birth, you are told you are divine. Servants bow to you before you can walk. Priests whisper that the sun rises because of your bloodline. Tutors don't correct you, they reinforce you. Every room you enter adjusts itself around your existence. You are never normal. You are never equal. You are never grounded. Now imagine the psychological effect. You are not allowed to fail. You are not allowed to doubt. You are not allowed to be human. Because if you are human, then the entire illusion cracks. And so ancient Egypt created something extraordinary. A system where the ruler was trapped by his own mythology. The pharaoh could command armies. But he could not admit fear. He could build monuments. But he could not confess weakness. Even grief had to be ritualized. Even anger had to be divine. This created a strange psychological tension. On one side, unlimited authority. On the other, zero emotional freedom. And that pressure did not disappear. It concentrated. It leaked. Sometimes it turned into grandiosity. Massive statues carved larger than life. Names etched deeper and deeper into stone. Endless repetition of titles. Son of Ra. Lord of the Two Lands. Living Horus. Because repetition is reinforcement. And reinforcement is survival. But what happens when someone raised to believe they are divine begins to question it? What happens when drought strikes? When plague spreads? When rebellion whispers in the south? If you are a god king, and reality contradicts you, the contradiction must be destroyed. Not debated. Destroyed. And so we see something fascinating in Egyptian history. Erased names. Defaced monuments. Entire rulers scratched out of existence. Because the most dangerous threat to divine authority is not invasion. It is memory. Take the concept of damnatio memoriae. When a pharaoh fell out of favor, politically or spiritually, his image was chiseled off walls. His cartouches removed. His statues broken. Why? Because in Egypt, to be remembered was to live forever. To erase someone was to kill them twice. Psychological control extended beyond death. Even the afterlife was regulated. The Book of the Dead was not just religious poetry. It was an instruction manual for cosmic judgment. Your heart would be weighed against Ma'at. And if it failed, you would be devoured. Not punished. Erased. This fear of erasure shaped behavior. It shaped obedience. It shaped loyalty. Power in Egypt was never just physical dominance. It was metaphysical threat. Obey, or risk cosmic annihilation. Support the pharaoh, or risk universal collapse. And for centuries, it worked. But power that absolute begins to distort the mind of the one who holds it. Some pharaohs responded with stability. Others with obsession. Consider the rulers who built beyond necessity. Monuments not as tombs, but as statements. Bigger than predecessors. Higher. More complex. Because when your identity depends on eternal remembrance, you compete with time itself. And time is ruthless. The pyramids were not only burial sites. They were psychological armor. Stone declarations against mortality. But no amount of stone stops decay. And that is where fear returns. Ancient Egypt feared death deeply. Not as an ending, but as a test. If rituals were performed incorrectly, if the tomb was violated, if the name was not spoken, the soul could wander. Power extended even here. The pharaoh ensured his immortality through scale, through wealth, through priestly devotion. Because divine status required eternal proof. But here is the darker layer. The more divine the pharaoh appeared, the more isolated he became. Isolation distorts perception. When everyone kneels, you forget how to listen. When criticism becomes blasphemy, you stop hearing truth. And this is where psychological decay begins. There were rulers who genuinely believed they could reshape religion. Reshape the gods. Reshape reality. Because when you are raised as divine, why wouldn't you? And so Egypt occasionally experienced spiritual revolutions imposed from the throne. The system trembled. Priests resisted. The population adjusted. Because survival meant adaptation. But each disruption left cracks. And cracks reveal something critical. Ancient Egyptian power was stable. But it was never invincible. Behind the gold masks and towering obelisks, there was anxiety. Constant anxiety. What if the Nile fails? What if the priests grow stronger than the throne? What if the army becomes loyal to a general instead? What if the people stop believing? Belief is the currency of divine kingship. Lose belief. Lose everything. And so propaganda became sacred art. Wall carvings always show victory. Even when history suggests stalemate. Pharaohs are depicted towering over enemies. Calm. Unbothered. Unmatched. Because perception sustains order. But perception is fragile. Over time, the divine aura weakened. Foreign powers entered. Internal conflicts rose. Priests gained influence. And the pharaoh slowly shifted. From God to administrator. And that shift was psychological catastrophe. Because once you admit the ruler is human, you invite accountability. Ancient Egypt lasted thousands of years. But its power structure depended on a delicate illusion. That one person held back chaos. And illusions demand maintenance. Maintenance demands control. Control breeds fear. Fear breeds silence. Silence breeds stagnation. And stagnation invites collapse. The dark psychology of ancient Egyptian power was not cruelty. It was fragility disguised as eternity. It was a civilization terrified of disorder. That created a system so rigid it eventually cracked under its own weight. The pharaoh stood at the center. Glorious. Untouchable. Divine. And profoundly alone. Because to be a god among mortals is to never be allowed to be human. And that may have been the greatest cost of all. Because the story does not end with isolation. It deepens. Power in ancient Egypt was never just inherited. It was performed. Every morning the pharaoh did not simply wake. He emerged. Servants prepared garments layered with symbolism. Linen purified. Gold polished. Crown selected not for fashion, but for message. The white crown of Upper Egypt. The red crown of Lower Egypt. Sometimes combined. Sometimes separate. Each choice was a psychological statement. Unity. Dominance. Control. Nothing was accidental. Because in a system built on divine perception, optics were reality. But performance takes energy. And the longer the performance continues, the harder it becomes to distinguish role from self. Imagine being told since childhood that your breath aligns with the sun god. That storms respond to your morality. That famine reflects your spiritual failure. Every natural fluctuation becomes personal. A low Nile is not weather. It is accusation. A plague is not biology. It is judgment. This is the hidden pressure beneath divine kingship. The pharaoh carried the anxiety of nature itself. And nature does not negotiate. When harvests failed, rituals intensified. When foreign threats rose, inscriptions grew louder. When dissent whispered, monuments multiplied. Because insecurity in a divine system cannot be admitted. It must be drowned in spectacle. There were times when the priesthood grew powerful enough to rival the throne. Temples accumulated wealth. Priests controlled ritual knowledge. And knowledge is leverage. The pharaoh was divine, yes. But the priests interpreted the divine. That tension created a silent psychological rivalry. Who truly mediated between humanity and the gods? The king? Or those who spoke on behalf of the gods? In some periods, the priesthood's influence expanded so greatly that the pharaoh became symbol more than sovereign. Still worshipped. Still displayed. But subtly guided. Controlled through ritual obligation. Bound by tradition. Power, when wrapped in sacred law, can become a cage. Even for the one at the top. And then there is succession. The most dangerous psychological fracture point in any monarchy. Because divine blood does not guarantee divine competence. A child can inherit a crown. But cannot inherit authority of presence. When a young pharaoh ascended, regents often ruled behind the scenes. Courts divided. Advisors competed. The illusion of divine certainty flickered. If the god-king needs guardians, is he truly a god? Whispers begin small. But whispers spread. This is why imagery mattered so intensely. Young rulers were depicted smiting enemies. Standing tall. Commanding armies. Even if they never held a sword. Because perception had to precede reality. Otherwise reality would overtake perception. And once belief faltered, chaos could rush in. Ancient Egypt feared chaos the way modern societies fear collapse of currency or infrastructure. It was not abstract. It was existential. They called it isfet. Disorder. Falsehood. Violence. To rule was to push back isfet daily. And that daily battle required psychological stamina few humans possess. So some rulers compensated. They overbuilt. They overdeclared. They overstated victories. Others withdrew. Let priests dominate. Let generals handle borders. They preserved image while surrendering substance. Both strategies reveal something crucial. Divine authority does not remove insecurity. It amplifies it. Because when your legitimacy depends on cosmic approval, any crack becomes catastrophic. There were moments in Egyptian history when foreign rulers took the throne. Libyan, Nubian, Persian, even Macedonian. And something fascinating happened. They adopted Egyptian divine symbolism immediately. Why? Because the psychological structure was too powerful to discard. To rule Egypt, you had to become Egyptian in spirit. You had to stand as Pharaoh. You had to honor Maat. You had to appear chosen by the gods of the Nile. Even conquerors understood this. Military control was insufficient. Psychological alignment was essential. This tells us something profound. The true strength of ancient Egyptian power was not armies. It was narrative consistency. For thousands of years, the same story persisted. The pharaoh sustains order. The gods approve. The Nile responds. Break the story. Break the civilization. But stories, no matter how strong, eventually meet reality. Trade routes shifted. Climate patterns changed. External empires expanded. Internal administration grew bloated. And slowly, the divine certainty that once defined the throne became ceremonial. Ritual continued. Temples functioned. Offerings were made. But the psychological intensity softened. The pharaoh became part of tradition rather than the axis of existence. And that shift is subtle. It does not look dramatic in carvings. It does not shout in inscriptions. But it echoes in outcomes. Because when belief transitions from fear-based reverence to inherited habit, its power diminishes. Ancient Egypt did not collapse in a single dramatic implosion. It thinned. Like fabric worn at the edges. Still recognizable. Still beautiful. But vulnerable. The dark psychology of its power was always built on tension. Control chaos. Project divinity. Suppress doubt. Outlast time. For centuries, this worked. Because the structure was elegant. Religion, governance, architecture, art, all synchronized to reinforce one truth. The pharaoh is necessary. Remove that necessity. And everything must reorganize. And eventually, it did. But what remains remarkable is how long the illusion endured. How effectively it shaped behavior. How deeply it structured identity. Even today, when we think of ancient Egypt, we think of grandeur. Pyramids piercing the sky. Golden masks gleaming in torchlight. Colossal statues staring into eternity. We rarely think of the psychological cost. The isolation of the throne. The anxiety beneath divinity. The constant pressure to appear eternal in a mortal body. Perhaps that is the final irony. The pharaohs sought immortality through stone. Through ritual. Through divine narrative. And in many ways, they succeeded. Their names are still spoken. Their monuments still stand. But their system, the delicate psychological architecture that made one human responsible for the universe, could not last forever. Because no single person can hold back chaos indefinitely. Not even a god-king. And maybe that is the quiet lesson beneath the monuments. Power built on fear of disorder can endure for centuries. But power built on the denial of human limitation will always carry fracture lines. Ancient Egypt mastered the art of divine projection. It understood symbolism better than any civilization before it. It crafted eternity from limestone and belief. But beneath the gold and granite, there was always a human heart. Beating. Uncertain. Burdened with the impossible expectation of perfection. And that burden, more than invasion, more than drought, more than rebellion, may have been the heaviest weight the pharaoh ever carried. And yet, even that weight was never spoken aloud. Because in ancient Egypt, language itself was power. To name something was to give it form. To carve something into stone was to make it real. So what was never carved? Doubt. Fear. Fatigue. You will not find inscriptions that read, "The pharaoh was uncertain today." You will not see reliefs of hesitation. You will not see temples dedicated to vulnerability. Because vulnerability contradicts divinity. Instead, you see symmetry. Stillness. Confidence frozen in profile. The pharaoh's face rarely changes across centuries. Calm eyes. Composed mouth. Ageless posture. Even when the ruler was elderly, ill, or inexperienced, the image remained untouched. Eternal youth was not vanity. It was psychological necessity. If the God-King ages visibly, then time is winning. And if time is winning, then eternity is a lie. So the image had to resist decay. Art became propaganda. But more than propaganda, reassurance. Reassurance that stability persisted. Reassurance that Ma'at held firm. Reassurance that chaos was contained. This constant reassurance reveals something profound. Ancient Egypt was not arrogant. It was anxious. Anxious about the unpredictable Nile. Anxious about succession disputes. Anxious about priestly ambition. Anxious about the afterlife. Anxious about memory. So it constructed a system that eliminated visible uncertainty. But eliminating visible uncertainty does not eliminate uncertainty itself. It buries it. And buried pressure builds. There were pharaohs who faced internal revolts. There were years when grain shortages strained loyalty. There were moments when foreign powers loomed closer than inscriptions admitted. In those moments, the psychology of power became survival theater. Victory scenes were carved even after inconclusive battles. Enemies were depicted crushed beneath royal sandals. Not because it was always true, but because it needed to be true. For the system to survive, perception had to outrun reality. And most of the time, it did. But over generations, something subtle changed. The divine narrative that once demanded emotional intensity began to feel ceremonial. Ritual repeated without the same urgency. Symbols preserved without the same fear. The pharaoh was still sacred. But perhaps not terrifyingly so. And when fear softens, scrutiny grows. Once scrutiny grows, divinity shrinks. This is not a sudden collapse. It is erosion. Like the slow wearing of hieroglyphs by desert wind. Still visible. But fading. And consider the ultimate contradiction. The pharaoh's role was to guarantee continuity. To ensure that Egypt remained stable, eternal, unbroken. But the very concentration of power into one sacred figure meant that every transition carried risk. Each death reopened vulnerability. Each succession required reinforcement of belief. And belief demands effort. So generation after generation, Egypt reinvested in the same psychological architecture. Temples expanded. Ceremonies elaborated. Titles multiplied. The divine narrative thickened. Because maintaining cosmic authority is exhausting work. Eventually, external empires arrived not merely with armies, but with alternative systems. Alternative cosmologies. Alternative political structures. And for the first time, Egypt's divine monarchy faced frameworks that did not depend on one human holding back chaos. This was destabilizing in a new way. Because when people see that the sun rises under different rulers, the myth begins to loosen. When the Nile floods under foreign kings, the exclusivity of divine blood weakens. And when administration continues under new banners, The idea that only one sacred lineage sustains order begins to feel negotiable. That is the quiet revolution. Not rebellion. Not invasion. But comparison. Comparison erodes absolutism. And ancient Egypt, once psychologically unshakable, slowly adapted. The pharaoh remained. But divinity blended with diplomacy. Sacred identity merged with political pragmatism. The ruler was still powerful. Still ceremonial. Still central. But no longer the sole hinge of existence. And perhaps that is the final stage of the dark psychology of Egyptian power. Transformation. From fear-based cosmic necessity to tradition. From divine isolation to historical memory. From living God to symbol. Yet even as symbol, the pharaoh endures in imagination. Because the idea is compelling. A single human embodying order. Standing between chaos and civilization. It speaks to something timeless in the human mind. The desire for certainty. For structure. For someone to blame when floods fail. For someone to praise when harvests thrive. Ancient Egypt perfected that psychological exchange. It offered clarity in a chaotic world. But clarity built on myth requires constant reinforcement. And eventually, reinforcement becomes strain. Still, we stand today in awe of what that system produced. Pyramids aligned with celestial precision. Temples etched with cosmic narratives. Art that froze divinity into geometry. A civilization that lasted millennia. That endurance was not accidental. It was engineered through belief. Through ritual. Through repetition. Through the careful cultivation of awe. But beneath the awe was always a human reality. A ruler navigating impossible expectations. A court balancing ambition and loyalty. A priesthood managing sacred authority. A population negotiating faith and survival. And at the center of it all, the quiet, unspoken understanding. That chaos never truly disappears. It waits. It shifts. It tests. And power, no matter how divine, must constantly negotiate with it. The pharaoh's greatest achievement was not immortality. It was delay. Delay of disorder. Delay of fragmentation. Delay of collapse. For thousands of years, that delay held. And perhaps that is more extraordinary than any monument. Because stone can be carved. But belief must be sustained. And sustaining belief across centuries may be the most powerful act of all. The sun sets over the Nile. As it did then. As it does now. Golden light touches temple walls. Statues remain silent. The divine faces still gaze forward. Unblinking. Unaging. But somewhere beneath the carved serenity, if we listen closely, we can almost hear the heartbeat of the humans who carried the illusion. Steady. Burdened. Determined. Holding back chaos for one more day. And then another. And in that repetition, one more day, and then another, we begin to understand the true rhythm of Egyptian power. It was not explosive. It was not constantly dramatic. It was ritualistic. Measured. Cyclical. Like the Nile itself. The river flooded. The river receded. The fields bloomed. The fields dried. And in that cycle, the pharaoh's presence acted as a stabilizing symbol. Not because he physically commanded the waters. But because people needed to believe someone stood above unpredictability. Uncertainty is exhausting. Ancient Egypt engineered relief from that exhaustion. It offered an explanation for everything. If the harvest thrived, the gods were pleased. If famine struck, ritual correction could restore balance. There was always a reason. Always a structure. Always a path back to order. And that predictability is psychologically powerful. It reduces panic. It reduces chaos. It reduces the fear of randomness. But it also creates dependency. If stability flows through one sacred figure, then questioning that figure feels dangerous. Not just politically dangerous. Cosmically dangerous. And so obedience becomes self-preservation. This is where the system becomes self-sustaining. The pharaoh reinforces Ma'at. Ma'at reinforces social harmony. Social harmony reinforces the pharaoh. A closed loop of belief. And within that loop, individuality softens. Personal ambition must align with cosmic order. Public dissent becomes spiritual imbalance. The system rewards conformity. It punishes deviation, sometimes subtly, sometimes absolutely. Yet even within such a controlled structure, humanity persists. Courts were filled with advisors who maneuvered carefully. Generals who weighed loyalty against opportunity. Priests who interpreted divine will with strategic precision. And common people who adapted quietly to whatever narrative dominated the throne. Life continued. Markets operated. Children were raised. Artisans carved. Farmers sowed. For most Egyptians, the pharaoh was distant, symbolic rather than personal. And that distance may have been essential. The divine must remain slightly unreachable. Too close, and it becomes ordinary. Too ordinary, and it loses power. So the throne elevated itself physically and spiritually. Palaces separated. Temples restricted. Ceremonies exclusive. Access controlled. Mystery preserved. Mystery amplifies reverence. And reverence stabilizes authority. But mystery also isolates. And isolation shapes perception. A ruler surrounded only by affirmation may begin to believe in infallibility. Infallibility discourages adaptation. Adaptation is survival. Here lies the paradox. The very rigidity that preserved Egypt for centuries also limited its flexibility. When circumstances demanded rapid change, the weight of tradition slowed response. Because altering sacred structure risks destabilizing everything. And no pharaoh wanted to be remembered as the one who fractured eternity. Memory mattered deeply. To the Egyptians, remembrance was continuation. Names spoken were lives extended. Names erased were lives extinguished. So rulers built for memory. Carved for memory. Legislated for memory. They anticipated judgment not just in the afterlife, but in history. This awareness created another psychological layer. Performance not only for subjects, but for future generations. Every inscription was both announcement and insurance. Insurance that legacy would survive criticism. Insurance that narrative would outlast rivals. Insurance that divine identity would remain intact. And yet, despite this meticulous control of narrative, time intervenes. Sand covers statues. Water erodes reliefs. Empires shift. Languages change. Interpretations evolve. The certainty once embedded in stone becomes subject to archaeology. And the god-kings become study material. But even in transformation, the psychological blueprint remains fascinating. Ancient Egypt demonstrates how deeply belief can structure society. How symbolism can stabilize complexity. How ritual can regulate fear. How architecture can reinforce ideology. And how power, when fused with divinity, becomes both magnificent and fragile. Because divinity magnifies expectation. Magnified expectation magnifies pressure. Pressure magnifies error. And error, in a divine system, cannot be admitted easily. So it is concealed. Reframed. Redirected. Until concealment itself becomes heavy. Still, what lingers is not collapse. It is endurance. Over 3,000 years of recognizable continuity. Few civilizations approached that span. And that longevity suggests something profound. The psychology worked. It sustained. It adapted just enough. It reinforced just enough. It inspired just enough awe to keep the structure standing. Perhaps that is why we remain captivated. Not only by pyramids and gold, but by the idea. The idea that a civilization could align heaven, earth, ruler, and river into one cohesive narrative. The idea that a human being could stand at the center of that alignment, carrying divine symbolism on mortal shoulders. And perhaps, quietly, longing, just once, to set it down. To step away from ritual. To be unobserved. To feel uncertainty without cosmic consequence. But such moments, if they existed, left no carvings. No inscriptions. No grand declarations. They exist only in inference. In the silent spaces between hieroglyphs. In the stillness of statues. In the recognition that behind every god mask was a human face. Ancient Egypt teaches us that power is never purely external. It is psychological architecture. It is belief reinforced daily. It is narrative maintained carefully. It is fear managed skillfully. And when belief shifts, even slightly, architecture trembles. Yet for centuries, the trembling was contained. Held back by ceremony. By repetition. By awe. By the enduring image of a pharaoh standing tall against the horizon. Crown gleaming. Eyes forward. As if chaos itself hesitated at his command. And maybe, for a time, it truly did. And maybe that hesitation, that pause before chaos advances, is the real measure of power. Not domination. Not spectacle. But delay. Delay of fragmentation. Delay of uncertainty spilling into panic. Delay of fear becoming uncontrollable. Ancient Egypt mastered delay. It ritualized it. It sanctified it. It embedded it into daily life. Every sunrise was confirmation that order had survived the night. Every successful harvest was proof that balance endured. Every completed temple was reassurance that eternity was still possible. But delay is not permanence. And somewhere beneath the confidence of stone, the pharaoh understood this. Because death was unavoidable. Even for a living god. And death was the ultimate contradiction. If the pharaoh was divine, why must he die? Egypt answered this question not by denying death, but by redefining it. Death became transition. Continuation. Transformation into Osiris. The ruler did not cease. He shifted realms. This theological solution was brilliant. It preserved divine authority while acknowledging biological reality. But psychologically, it introduced urgency. If the afterlife determined eternal stability, then preparation had to be flawless. Tombs became fortresses. Burial rituals became complex. Objects were placed carefully, symbolically, obsessively. Because immortality required precision. And precision required control. The obsession with the afterlife reveals how deeply Egyptians feared disorder beyond the visible world. The pharaoh's successful journey ensured cosmic continuity. If his transition failed, uncertainty expanded. So even in death, the ruler carried responsibility. Even in burial, performance continued. And this endless responsibility, before death and after, suggests something quietly tragic. The pharaoh never escaped the role. Not in life. Not in death. Not in memory. To be divine was to be permanently burdened. And yet, ambition still sought the throne. Why? Because power intoxicates. Because reverence seduces. Because immortality, even constructed immortality, is irresistible. The throne promised transcendence. But delivered confinement. Confinement within expectation. Confinement within symbolism. Confinement within the gaze of a civilization. Perhaps that is why some rulers leaned into grandeur. If you cannot escape the role, expand it. Build larger. Declare louder. Engrave deeper. If eternity is the objective, overwhelm time with scale. Others, perhaps more cautious, focused on preservation. Maintain tradition. Honor precedent. Avoid disruption. Both approaches reveal awareness of fragility. Too much change invites instability. Too little change invites stagnation. Balance was everything. And balance required constant calibration. But calibration demands honest feedback. And honest feedback is rare when criticism equals sacrilege. In a system where the ruler embodies cosmic order, who dares say the order is flawed? This silence can be protective. It can also be dangerous. Because without correction, small errors compound. And compounded errors strain belief. Over centuries, as administration grew more complex and territories expanded, the divine center had to stretch. Governance required delegation. Delegation diluted direct authority. Regional powers gained influence. Priests accumulated wealth. Military leaders built loyalty among troops. The pharaoh remained supreme in theory. But theory competes with practicality. And practicality eventually tests mythology. Still, the mythology endured longer than most systems could imagine. Because it was not merely political. It was existential. It answered fundamental questions. Why does the river flood? Why does the sun rise? Why does society function? Who holds chaos at bay? The answer was always singular. The pharaoh. That simplicity is powerful. Modern systems distribute responsibility. Ancient Egypt concentrated it. And concentration magnifies both stability and risk. When the ruler was strong, order felt secure. When the ruler was weak, anxiety intensified. Yet even weak rulers were protected by ritual. The image remained consistent. The language remained reverent. The ceremonies remained precise. Consistency itself became a shield. Because as long as the structure looked intact, people could continue believing it was intact. This is the essence of psychological power. Not force. Not even fear alone. But continuity. Continuity builds trust. Trust builds compliance. Compliance builds endurance. And endurance builds legacy. Ancient Egypt achieved legacy beyond expectation. But legacy is not immortality of system. It is immortality of memory. The divine monarchy eventually dissolved. Foreign governance replaced sacred kingship. Religious paradigms shifted. Temples fell silent. But the image survived. The golden mask. The towering pyramid. The serene, forward-facing gaze. We remember the symbol. Even when the structure behind it no longer exists. And that may be the final triumph of Egyptian psychological power. It outlived itself. Its architecture of belief became so compelling that thousands of years later, we still feel its gravity. We still imagine the pharaoh as more than human. We still speak of god-kings with a hint of awe. The system no longer governs. But it still influences imagination. Which suggests something extraordinary. Power, when fused with narrative deeply enough, transcends its own era. It becomes myth. And myth is resilient. But behind every myth is a human origin. A ruler waking before dawn. A ceremony rehearsed. A crown placed carefully upon mortal skin. A silent moment before stepping into public divinity. In that silent moment, perhaps, the pharaoh felt the full weight. The expectation. The isolation. The impossibility of perfection. And then, as the doors opened and the court bowed low, the performance resumed. Because chaos does not wait. Because belief must be sustained. Because order must be visible. And so the God King stepped forward again. Radiant. Composed. Carrying the illusion that held a civilization together. One more sunrise. One more flood. One more year of balance. Until time, patient and relentless, claimed even divinity. And left behind stone. And story. And the enduring question. Was the pharaoh powerful because he was believed to be divine? Or was he divine because the people needed someone powerful enough to believe in? That question lingers longer than any monument. And perhaps, in that lingering, the dark psychology of ancient Egyptian power truly reveals itself. That question does not demand an answer. It demands reflection. Because the deeper we look, the more we see that ancient Egyptian power was not simply imposed from above. It was participated in. Reinforced collectively. Sustained by shared investment. The farmer who offered grain at the temple. The artisan who carved the royal cartouche with care. The scribe who recorded victories in flawless hieroglyphs. The priest who recited hymns at dawn. Each one strengthened the structure. Each one added another layer to the illusion of permanence. Power was centralized. But belief was distributed. And distributed belief is extraordinarily durable. It becomes culture. It becomes habit. It becomes identity. Children grew up never questioning that the pharaoh stood between them and cosmic disorder. It was not debated at dinner tables. It was assumed like gravity. When assumptions root deeply enough, they feel natural. And what feels natural rarely feels oppressive. This is how psychological systems sustain themselves. Not through constant force. But through normalization. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. Divinity becomes daily. And daily divinity becomes invisible. Invisible power is the most stable kind. Because it is rarely challenged. Yet invisibility can breed complacency. When something feels permanent, vigilance fades. The rituals continue. But the urgency softens. The monuments stand. But fewer hands tremble with awe. And slowly, reverence transforms into tradition. Tradition is strong. But not as intense as fear. Fear once kept chaos at the edges. Tradition preserves memory. And memory does not command the same obedience. This gradual shift altered the psychology of the throne. The pharaoh no longer needed to terrify. He needed to represent. Representation is different from embodiment. Earlier rulers embodied cosmic order. Later rulers symbolized it. A subtle but important distinction. Embodiment demands belief. Symbolism allows interpretation. Interpretation invites flexibility. Flexibility introduces variation. Variation erodes absolutism. And absolutism was the spine of divine kingship. Still, even as the system softened, it never fully shattered overnight. Because ancient Egypt was adaptive within limits. It absorbed foreign gods into its pantheon. It merged deities. It reinterpreted myths. It allowed cultural blending, as long as the core remained intact. That core was hierarchy aligned with heaven. As long as heaven endorsed hierarchy, the structure survived. But what happens when heaven changes? When new spiritual ideas arrive? When alternative explanations for natural order circulate? Then belief diversifies. And diversified belief weakens singular authority. The pharaoh could tolerate multiple gods. But not multiple ultimate truths. Once ultimate truth fragments, divine monopoly dissolves. Yet even then, Egypt persisted in form. Temples remained active. Ceremonies continued. Crowns still gleamed. Because identity does not vanish easily. It lingers in architecture. In language. In posture. Even when belief shifts, the aesthetic remains. That aesthetic, Rigid profile faces, idealized bodies, serene expressions, communicated timelessness. Timelessness was the ultimate aspiration. To appear outside change. Outside decay. Outside doubt. But no civilization escapes change. And ancient Egypt's greatest psychological challenge was this. How do you maintain an image of eternity in a world defined by cycles? Flood and drought. Growth and decay. Life and death. Rise and decline. The answer was ritual. Ritual interrupts anxiety. It creates predictability within unpredictability. Morning offerings. Seasonal festivals. Coronations. Burials. Repetition reassures. And for thousands of years, that reassurance was enough. But even ritual can become hollow if belief weakens. Once hollow, it becomes performance without conviction. And performance without conviction cannot anchor eternity. Yet it would be a mistake to view this as simple decline. Because what ancient Egypt created was not merely a monarchy. It was a psychological ecosystem. Religion, governance, art, economy, all intertwined. Disentangling one strand affected all others. That interconnectedness slowed collapse. It allowed gradual transformation instead of abrupt destruction. And perhaps that gradual transformation is why we still feel its presence. There was no singular dramatic ending. No final catastrophic implosion that erased identity. Instead, there was absorption. Integration into new empires. Adaptation into new spiritual frameworks. Reinterpretation through foreign lenses. The pharaoh eventually became historical rather than divine. But history can preserve what theology relinquishes. Today, we analyze what they revered. We excavate what they sanctified. We decode what they carved. And in doing so, we participate in a different kind of immortality. The pharaoh no longer holds back cosmic chaos. But he holds our attention. Our curiosity. Our imagination. And perhaps that is a quieter form of power. The dark psychology of ancient Egyptian authority reveals something universal. Humans crave structure. They crave reassurance that chaos is managed. They crave visible symbols of stability. And when uncertainty rises, they gravitate toward narratives that promise order. Ancient Egypt perfected that narrative. It wrapped governance in divinity. It fused politics with cosmology. It elevated leadership into sacred inevitability. And in doing so, it achieved something rare. Continuity beyond normal historical scale. Yet continuity came with cost. Isolation of the ruler. Suppression of doubt. Rigidity of structure. Dependence on singular belief. Every system trades something for stability. Egypt traded vulnerability for endurance. But vulnerability always waits beneath the surface. Waiting for a moment when ritual falters. When belief hesitates. When comparison intrudes. Still, the image persists. A lone figure crowned, standing against the desert horizon. Sunlight behind him. River before him. Empire around him. Chaos held at bay. Whether that chaos was ever truly conquered is less important than the fact that people believed it was. Because belief shapes behavior. Behavior shapes history. And history shapes memory. The pharaoh's power may have dissolved. But the psychological architecture remains instructive. It reminds us that authority is rarely sustained by force alone. It is sustained by narrative. By symbolism. By shared participation in an agreed reality. Ancient Egypt agreed, for a very long time, that one human being embodied order. And as long as that agreement held, so did the civilization. When the agreement changed, the structure evolved. Not vanished. Evolved. Stone weathered. Gods merged. Crowns passed into museums. But the question endures. How much of power is performance? How much of stability is story? How much of eternity is carefully maintained illusion? And if we look closely enough at any system, ancient or modern, do we find the same quiet truth? That behind every symbol of certainty, there is a human being hoping the performance holds one more day. Ancient Egypt held it for thousands of years. And that, perhaps, is its most astonishing achievement. And astonishing achievements often hide ordinary beginnings. Before the gold crowns. Before the monumental statues. Before the carefully measured pyramids aligned to the stars. There were small communities along a river trying to survive. The Nile was generous. But it was not predictable enough to be trusted blindly. Its flooding nourished the soil. Its retreat revealed fertile land. But if the waters came too high, villages drowned. If they came too low, crops withered. Dependence on a river teaches humility. It also teaches vigilance. Over time, survival required coordination. Coordination required leadership. Leadership required legitimacy. And legitimacy, in a world ruled by natural forces, demanded divine explanation. This is where psychology and environment intertwined. The pharaoh did not emerge from arrogance. He emerged from necessity. A unifying figure to centralize irrigation. To mobilize labor. To resolve disputes. To represent stability. But representation alone was insufficient. Because humans question authority unless it feels inevitable. So inevitability was crafted. Not through speeches. But through myth. Through sacred lineage. Through alignment with cosmic order. The ruler was not chosen by people. He was chosen by heaven. And heaven does not debate. This removed negotiation from the equation. It removed the instability of election. It removed the fragility of popularity. Divine right stabilized succession, at least in theory. In practice, succession remained tense. Brothers rivaled brothers. Sons replaced fathers. Occasionally, daughters ascended where no male heir secured consensus. Each transition risked fracture. So rituals intensified around coronation. Symbols multiplied. Titles lengthened. The new pharaoh was not merely introduced. He was transformed. Transformation reassured continuity. Continuity reassured the population. But beneath the ceremony, political calculation always lingered. All courts contain ambition. Even sacred courts. Officials accumulated influence. Regional governors developed power bases. Military leaders gained loyalty from soldiers. The pharaoh sat at the apex. But the pyramid beneath him was layered with human interests. Maintaining balance among those interests required subtlety. Too much trust in one faction risked alienating another. Too much reliance on priests risked empowering religious authority beyond control. Too much military focus risked dependency on force. So the throne navigated constantly. Divine in image. Pragmatic in practice. And that duality is crucial. Because it reveals that Egyptian power was not naive. It understood complexity. It understood human ambition. It simply framed complexity within sacred language. Sacred language is powerful because it elevates political conflict into moral territory. Disloyalty becomes sin. Rebellion becomes disorder. Opposition becomes cosmic threat. This framing reduces dissent. But it also increases stakes. When conflict arises in a sacred system, compromise becomes difficult. Because compromise feels like spiritual weakness. And spiritual weakness risks destabilizing Ma'at itself. Yet despite these pressures, Egyptian society maintained remarkable coherence. Agriculture functioned. Trade networks expanded. Craftsmanship flourished. Art retained stylistic continuity across centuries. Such continuity suggests that, for most people, the system provided enough predictability to feel secure. Security fosters creativity. And creativity reinforces pride. Pride reinforces identity. Identity reinforces the system. Again, a closed loop. But loops can tighten. When external forces pressed inward, economic strain, foreign invasion, shifting alliances, the loop constricted. The divine narrative had to stretch to accommodate new realities. Sometimes it did so gracefully. Foreign rulers adopted Egyptian titles. Presented themselves as rightful pharaohs. Performed rituals convincingly. Because to rule Egypt, you had to inhabit its psychological framework. Even conquerors bowed to the myth. That alone reveals the myth's strength. It was not easily discarded. It was absorbed. Adapted. Repurposed. But absorption can dilute essence. Gradually, the throne's sacred aura merged with foreign cosmologies. New languages entered administration. New gods were acknowledged. New political philosophies circulated. The once singular center became part of a broader world. And when a system once considered the axis of existence becomes one among many, its psychological dominance fades. Yet it does not vanish entirely. It transitions from living structure to cultural memory. Temples become relics. Ceremonies become historical reenactments. God-kings become subjects of study. But memory can outlast function. In some ways, memory is more enduring than governance. Because governance requires constant maintenance. Memory requires only preservation. And ancient Egypt preserved itself in stone so effectively that millennia later, its presence still feels immediate. We stand before pyramids and sense intention. We gaze at colossal statues and feel authority. We examine intricate tomb paintings and detect ritual precision. The psychology still communicates across time. It tells us that power once flowed through these forms. That belief once animated these halls. That a civilization once trusted in the divine necessity of a single ruler. And perhaps we recognize something familiar. Because human societies still grapple with chaos. Still seek reassurance. Still construct symbols of stability. Still elevate leaders beyond ordinary humanity. Ancient Egypt simply perfected this tendency early. It systematized it. Sacralized it. Architected it into every layer of life. And in doing so, it sustained one of the longest continuous political identities in history. But endurance is not immunity. The dark psychology of Egyptian power teaches that systems built on divine concentration are both resilient and brittle. Resilient because belief binds tightly. Brittle because belief, once fractured, spreads cracks quickly. For centuries, cracks were patched with ritual. With spectacle. With monument. With narrative control. Eventually, the patches thinned. But the foundation had already accomplished something extraordinary. It held back chaos, or at least the fear of chaos, long enough to create art, literature, science, and architecture that still command admiration. And so the story is not tragedy. Nor triumph alone. It is complexity. A civilization that understood the human need for order so deeply that it embodied that need in a single sacred figure. A figure who bore expectation beyond any mortal capacity. A throne that offered stability at the cost of vulnerability. A people who participated willingly in sustaining the myth because the myth sustained them in return. In the end, the pharaoh's greatest power was not divinity. It was consensus. Consensus that order existed. Consensus that ritual mattered. Consensus that the river would rise. Consensus that the cosmos was balanced. As long as consensus endured, so did Egypt. When consensus shifted, so did history. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson etched between hieroglyphs. Power is never only about dominance. It is about shared belief in structure. Remove the shared belief. And even stone begins to feel fragile. Yet for thousands of years, that belief stood as firm as the pyramids. And that is why we still whisper its name. Ancient Egypt. A civilization that dared to make order sacred. And for a very long time. Succeeded. Succeeded, not because it eliminated chaos. But because it gave chaos a face. A name. A boundary. Isfet. Disorder was not random in the Egyptian mind. It was a force. A presence. Something that could be resisted. Resisting something feels more possible than resisting nothing. And so by defining chaos, they made it manageable. By embodying order in the pharaoh, they made resistance visible. Every time the king performed ritual, he was symbolically pushing back Isfet. Every offering placed before a god was an act of cosmic maintenance. Maintenance is less glamorous than conquest. But it is far more sustainable. This is another psychological brilliance of Egyptian power. It did not promise endless expansion. It promised balance. Balance is achievable. Perfection is not. So the pharaoh's role was not to create utopia. It was to prevent collapse. Preventing collapse feels urgent. And urgency sustains attention. But urgency over centuries becomes fatigue. Imagine generations living under the quiet assumption that existence itself depends on a sacred hierarchy. That the sun's rising is linked to ritual accuracy. That the Nile's flooding reflects moral alignment. This belief stabilizes life. But it also embeds pressure deeply into culture. Pressure to conform. Pressure to preserve. Pressure to repeat without deviation. Innovation becomes cautious. Because change risks imbalance. And imbalance risks chaos. Yet human curiosity does not disappear. Trade introduced new ideas. Contact introduced new technologies. Exposure introduced comparison. Comparison is subtle but powerful. If other societies function without a divine pharaoh, then perhaps divine monarchy is not the only path to order. Such realizations do not erupt immediately. They simmer. Slowly adjusting perception. Slowly widening the frame of possibility. And with widened possibility comes softened exclusivity. The pharaoh remains important. But no longer unimaginable without. That shift, from unimaginable to replaceable, is seismic in psychological terms. It marks the transition from sacred necessity to historical tradition. Yet even as sacred intensity waned, aesthetic power endured. The visual language of Egypt remained unmistakable. Profile faces. Forward-facing eyes. Rigid posture. Symbol-heavy crowns. This artistic consistency reinforced identity even when political control fluctuated. Art became anchor. Architecture became memory. And memory became legacy. In this way, ancient Egypt achieved a form of immortality different from what its rulers envisioned. They sought eternal divine rule. What survived instead was eternal cultural presence. And perhaps that survival is more profound. Because divine authority requires belief. But cultural fascination requires only curiosity. Today, no one fears Isfet in the ancient sense. No one believes a pharaoh holds back the sun. Yet we still stand in awe of their structures. Still ponder their theology. Still analyze their inscriptions. The power has shifted from governance to inspiration. From control to contemplation. And that transformation reveals something gentle beneath the darkness. The system that once demanded unquestioned obedience now invites study. The throne that once symbolized cosmic inevitability now symbolizes human ambition. The divine mask has fallen. But the human achievement remains. Perhaps that is the quiet redemption of the story. The pharaoh no longer bears the burden of sustaining the universe. The stones no longer need to hold back chaos. The rituals no longer need to guarantee sunrise. They exist as testament. As evidence that for thousands of years, a civilization organized itself around a single idea. Order is sacred. And preserving order is worth everything. That idea built pyramids. It structured society. It endured invasion. It navigated famine. It adapted across dynasties. Few civilizations demonstrate such sustained coherence. And coherence, in a chaotic world, is extraordinary. The dark psychology of ancient Egyptian power was not merely about control. It was about reassurance. Reassurance that life followed pattern. That death followed transition. That the cosmos followed law. That someone stood watch at the center. Even if that center was human. Even if that human trembled privately beneath golden regalia. Even if that illusion required constant reinforcement. For millennia, it worked. And perhaps that is the final reflection. All systems of power are, at some level, agreements. Agreements about who leads. Agreements about what matters. Agreements about how the world functions. Ancient Egypt made its agreement sacred. By doing so, it amplified both its strength and its fragility. Sacred agreements inspire loyalty. But they resist revision. And revision is inevitable. Still, when we look across the desert horizon and see the silhouette of pyramids against the fading light, we do not see fragility first. We see endurance. We see ambition carved into landscape. We see belief made tangible. And somewhere in that silhouette, we can almost sense the presence of a ruler long gone. Not as a god. Not as a tyrant. But as a symbol of humanity's relentless desire to impose meaning on uncertainty. To carve stability from shifting sand. To declare order in the face of endless change. Ancient Egypt did not conquer chaos forever. No civilization does. But it negotiated with chaos longer than most. And in that negotiation, it created one of history's most powerful psychological architectures. A throne at the center. A river beneath. A sun above. And a people who believed, deeply, collectively, persistently, that balance was possible. For thousands of years, that belief held. And sometimes, belief holding is enough. And when belief holds long enough, it begins to feel indistinguishable from truth. That is perhaps the most subtle power ancient Egypt wielded. Not force. Not spectacle alone. But duration. When a narrative survives generation after generation, it becomes embedded in instinct. A child born into the Nile Valley did not question whether the pharaoh sustained Ma'at. They inhaled that idea with the desert air. They saw it in temple walls. Heard it in hymns. Watched it in festivals. Participation began before understanding. Understanding followed repetition. Repetition became certainty. And certainty shaped behavior without constant enforcement. That is psychological mastery. The system did not need to shout. It surrounded. It structured time itself. The calendar was sacred. Flood season. Planting season. Harvest season. Each phase tied to divine rhythm. Each rhythm anchored to the throne. Time was not neutral. It was sanctified. And when time is sanctified, authority feels timeless. Timeless authority feels unchallengeable. But time, ironically, is the one force no system controls. Generations shift temperament. Economic pressures fluctuate. Environmental patterns alter subtly. External powers test boundaries. And slowly, without dramatic rupture, perception evolves. When perception evolves, power must adapt or risk rigidity. Ancient Egypt adapted many times. It reconfigured religious emphasis. Elevated different deities. Shifted administrative centers. Merged cultures. Yet always, it tried to preserve the central image. A ruler aligned with heaven. But alignment becomes harder when heaven multiplies. When competing cosmologies emerge. When foreign gods coexist beside native ones. When spiritual authority fragments. The pharaoh could incorporate. But incorporation diluted singular focus. Over centuries, sacred centralization became shared symbolism. Shared symbolism lacks the sharp edge of exclusive divinity. It is softer. More diplomatic. Less absolute. And absolutism was the original engine of Egyptian psychological power. Still, even as absolutism softened, continuity endured. Because identity had become deeper than politics. It was in writing. In architecture. In burial custom. In the orientation of temples toward celestial events. These patterns reinforced cohesion even when belief diversified. Cohesion is different from intensity. Intensity drives expansion. Cohesion sustains stability. Egypt transitioned from intensity to cohesion. From fervent divine monarchy to enduring cultural tradition. And in that transition, something fascinating occurred. The pharaoh's role shifted from cosmic guardian to historical archetype. He became a template of leadership rather than an irreplaceable divine force. Templates can be replicated. Archetypes can be studied. Divinity cannot be negotiated. This shift made Egypt more flexible. But less mythically singular. Yet perhaps that flexibility prolonged its presence within changing empires. Absolute systems often shatter when confronted with alternatives. Egypt's later adaptability allowed integration rather than annihilation. It survived through transformation. And transformation is a quiet form of survival. Even when the last native pharaoh no longer ruled, Egyptian identity did not vanish. Temples remained active under new authorities. Ritual languages persisted. Artistic styles echoed centuries past. The divine monarchy faded. But the cultural memory of divine monarchy endured. And memory can outlive power. That endurance invites reflection. Why does ancient Egypt still captivate? Why does its imagery still command silence? Why do we still gaze at pyramids with reverence? Because beneath the stone lies a universal tension. The tension between order and chaos. Between permanence and decay. Between mortality and the longing for eternity. The pharaoh was a solution to that tension. A human answer to cosmic uncertainty. Perhaps not objectively necessary. But psychologically compelling. And compelling ideas persist long after their structures dissolve. The dark psychology of ancient Egyptian power ultimately reveals something less sinister and more human. It shows how deeply societies crave reassurance. How far they will go to preserve balance. How willing they are to elevate individuals into symbols if those symbols promise stability. And it shows the cost of such elevation. Isolation. Pressure. Expectation beyond human scale. The pharaoh stood alone at the symbolic center of existence. But that center was built by collective need. Remove the need, and the center shifts. Yet for thousands of years, the need remained. And the center held. Perhaps that is the quiet triumph. Not that Egypt defeated chaos. But that it delayed fragmentation long enough to create beauty that still speaks. Beauty carved with intention. Aligned with stars. Layered with meaning. Whispering across millennia that once, along a river, a civilization believed so deeply in order that it built eternity from stone. And even though eternity proved symbolic rather than literal, the symbol endured. The river still flows. The sun still rises. The desert still guards its monuments. The divine kings are dust. But their psychological architecture remains visible to anyone who looks closely. A reminder that power is strongest when it convinces people that it is necessary. A reminder that necessity can be constructed. And a reminder that even the most magnificent systems are, at their core, agreements sustained by belief. Ancient Egypt sustained that agreement longer than almost any civilization before or since. And in doing so, it carved not just monuments, but a lesson. Order can be made sacred. Sacred order can endure. But nothing, not even a god-king crowned in gold, stands outside time forever. And yet, in the quiet of the desert at dusk, as shadows stretch across ancient stone, it almost feels as if they did. Almost. That single word captures the entire illusion. Almost eternal. Almost divine. Almost beyond decay. And in that, almost, we find the truth of ancient Egyptian power. Because what the pharaoh truly mastered was proximity to eternity. Close enough to feel invincible. Close enough to inspire awe. Close enough to silence doubt. But never fully beyond the reach of time. Time is patient. It does not rebel. It does not shout. It erodes. Slowly. Quietly. Relentlessly. The Nile shifts its banks by inches. The desert wind softens carved lines. Dynasties shorten. Treasuries thin. Priesthoods gain leverage. Foreign merchants become diplomats. Diplomats become governors. Governors become rulers. And all the while, the rituals continue. Because ritual is resistance. Resistance against the admission that change is happening. The morning offering still burns. The hymn is still sung. The crown is still lifted. And for a moment, continuity feels intact. But continuity can survive surface change only so long. Eventually, the meaning behind repetition begins to dilute. When a ceremony is performed without the same fear of chaos behind it, it becomes tradition rather than necessity. Tradition comforts. Necessity compels. Egypt thrived when divine kingship felt necessary. It endured when divine kingship became traditional. And when it became symbolic, it transformed into memory. This transformation was not dramatic. There was no final ritual declaring the end of god-kings. No proclamation admitting the sun would rise without sacred mediation. It simply continued. Under new names. New empires. New interpretations. The structure of divine monarchy faded into the background of a changing world. But something remained. The psychological pattern. The instinct to center authority. The tendency to elevate leaders into symbols larger than themselves. The desire to believe someone stands between order and collapse. These patterns did not disappear with the pharaoh. They echo through history. In different forms. Different languages. Different crowns. Ancient Egypt did not invent this instinct. But it refined it. Systematized it. Gave it architecture and ritual. Turned it into an art form. And perhaps that is why its memory feels so heavy. So complete. So intentional. Because it was not only political organization. It was existential design. A civilization built around the question. How do we live in a world that can fall apart? Their answer. Make order sacred. Make leadership divine. Make repetition eternal. Make doubt invisible. And for a very long time, that answer worked. The fields yielded grain. The people labored with purpose. The monuments rose. The gods received offerings. The pharaoh stood at the center. And chaos waited at the edge. But chaos never vanishes. It adapts. It seeps through cracks too small to notice at first. An underfunded province. A disputed succession. A weakened flood. A powerful priesthood. An ambitious general. Each small shift alone is manageable. Together, they reshape reality. The divine narrative strains to explain complexity. And when explanation grows complicated, belief grows fragile. Still, even in fragility, Egypt's structure did not collapse into immediate ruin. Because thousands of years of shared identity cannot evaporate overnight. It lingered. It adjusted. It folded into broader empires. And in folding, it preserved fragments of itself. Fragments that survived conquest. Fragments that survived religious transformation. Fragments that survived language loss. The pharaoh ceased to rule. But the image of the pharaoh remained. And that image still commands silence. Perhaps because we recognize the burden in it. The impossible expectation of embodying stability. The loneliness of standing above everyone yet belonging fully to no one. The pressure of being told that if you falter, the universe falters. It is easy to admire the gold. Harder to imagine the weight. The dark psychology of ancient Egyptian power was not cruelty at its core. It was fear, organized, ritualized, aestheticized fear. Fear of disorder. Fear of unpredictability. Fear of mortality. Fear of being forgotten. And fear can build wonders. It can motivate coordination on a scale few civilizations achieve. It can align millions around a shared story. But fear cannot eliminate time. And time does not negotiate with divinity. Eventually, the sacred center became historical reference. The rituals became artifacts. The throne became museum exhibit. And yet, in some strange way, the pharaoh achieved a version of immortality. Not as a god. Not as a ruler. But as a symbol. A symbol of humanity's attempt to make permanence out of impermanence. To carve certainty into limestone. To align architecture with the stars and say, we matter. We endure. We are not at the mercy of chaos alone. That declaration still stands. Even if the belief that fueled it has transformed. Ancient Egypt did not conquer death. It reframed it. It did not eliminate chaos. It postponed it. It did not achieve eternity. It approached it. Almost. And sometimes, almost is enough to echo across millennia. Because perfection fades. But ambition leaves marks. The marks remain in stone. In sand. In imagination. And as long as we continue to look toward those monuments and wonder, the psychological architecture they built still functions. Not as authority. But as memory. Not as divine command. But as human testament. A reminder that civilizations, like individuals, construct narratives to survive uncertainty. Some narratives last centuries. Some last millennia. Few last as long as the one born along the Nile. A river. A crown. A sun. A promise of order. And a people who believed in it long enough to make it real. For thousands of years, that belief held back chaos. And even now, in the fading light over ancient stone, it feels as though it still might. Almost forever. That phrase lingers like heat above desert sand. Because what ancient Egypt teaches us is not how to escape impermanence. It teaches us how to negotiate with it. The negotiation was subtle. You cannot defeat time. But you can outlast your enemies. You cannot stop death. But you can choreograph it. You cannot eliminate chaos. But you can define it so clearly that people fear stepping outside your definition. And so the pharaoh did not merely rule territory. He ruled interpretation. He ruled meaning. He ruled the boundaries of what could be imagined. When drought came, it was not random. It was imbalance. When plague struck, it was not accident. It was divine signal. When rebellion stirred, it was not political dissatisfaction. It was disorder threatening cosmic harmony. Language itself became architecture. Reality filtered through ritual. And ritual, repeated long enough, becomes truth. This is where the psychology deepens. Because the system did not rely only on obedience. It relied on internalization. A farmer along the Nile did not wake each morning thinking, I am serving a political regime. He thought, I am participating in order. Participation feels meaningful. Submission feels humiliating. Egypt mastered the art of transforming submission into participation. You do not serve a king. You sustain Ma'at. You do not build a tomb. You contribute to eternity. You do not labor in heat. You uphold balance between earth and sky. When identity fuses with cosmic duty, dissent becomes existential risk. To question leadership becomes to question reality. And few societies have ever woven that connection so tightly. Yet even within this structure, cracks appeared. Not because people were foolish. But because humans are complex. Ambitious. Curious. Restless. Priests accumulated knowledge. Generals accumulated loyalty. Administrators accumulated influence. The more complex the state became, the more power fragmented. And fragmentation is subtle. It rarely announces itself. It grows in parallel. A priesthood that begins as servant to divine kingship can evolve into guardian of sacred knowledge. Knowledge becomes leverage. Leverage becomes negotiation. Negotiation becomes rivalry. The pharaoh remains divine in public. But privately, power becomes distributed. When power distributes, narrative strains. And narrative strain requires reinforcement. More temples. More inscriptions. More grander monuments. Because when belief weakens, spectacle intensifies. The later monuments were not smaller because ambition declined. They were different because context shifted. Resources stretched. Borders pressured. Foreign influences arrived with new gods and new ideas. Trade expands imagination. When merchants bring stories from distant lands, cosmology expands. And when cosmology expands, exclusivity softens. If other civilizations also claim divine order, then divine order is no longer uniquely Egyptian. That realization does not destroy belief overnight. But it plants comparison. Comparison is dangerous to absolute systems. And so Egypt adapted. Foreign rulers adopted Egyptian titles. Conquerors dressed in traditional regalia. Even invaders understood the necessity of continuity. To rule Egypt, you must become Egyptian. That alone speaks volumes. The narrative was so deeply rooted that it absorbed outsiders. But absorption is not immortality. It is transformation. Each adaptation diluted the original concentration of divine kingship. The pharaoh became less central. The priesthood more influential. The empire more interconnected. And eventually, the old model was no longer sufficient to anchor identity. New religious frameworks rose. New political orders formed. The sacred center shifted. But even in transformation, the aesthetic remained powerful. Obelisks transported. Statues collected. Temples studied. Because grandeur commands attention long after authority fades. The dark psychology of Egyptian power rests here. It understood that human beings crave continuity more than freedom. Continuity promises safety. Freedom promises uncertainty. And in uncertain environments, flooding rivers, shifting deserts, unpredictable harvests, continuity becomes sacred. But continuity requires control. Control requires structure. Structure requires myth. And myth requires belief. Belief is fragile. So belief must be reinforced with beauty. With ritual. With repetition. With awe. The pyramids are not simply tombs. They are arguments. Arguments carved into geometry. Arguments stating that human intention can impose shape upon infinity. That order can rise from sand. That mortality can be engineered into memory. And perhaps that is why they still stand as psychological monuments. Because we, too, live with uncertainty. We, too, face forces beyond control. We, too, seek symbols of permanence. Modern societies may not crown living gods. But they build skylines. They preserve national myths. They elevate leaders into icons. The mechanisms evolve. The impulse remains. Ancient Egypt was not primitive in its psychology. It was sophisticated. It recognized that fear must be managed. That hope must be structured. That identity must be narrated. And it wove those recognitions into a civilization that lasted longer than most. Yet nothing escapes entropy. Even stone erodes. Even memory shifts. Even awe becomes tourism. But there is something strangely fitting in that transformation. Because the pharaoh sought eternity through narrative. And narrative survives through retelling. As long as we examine, question, reinterpret, the structure continues. Not as command, but as conversation. And perhaps that is a gentler form of immortality. Not being worshipped, but being remembered. Not being feared, but being studied. Not holding power, but inspiring reflection. Ancient Egypt's dark psychology reveals not a tyrant's trick, but a species strategy. We build systems to quiet chaos. We elevate symbols to quiet doubt. We repeat rituals to quiet time. We carve stone to quiet mortality. And for a while, the quiet holds. Then time resumes its whisper. And new systems rise. And new symbols form. And new rituals begin. But somewhere beneath modern noise, the same question hums. How do we make order feel eternal? Egypt answered with gold and limestone. With sun and river. With crown and cosmos. And the echo of that answer still lingers in human imagination. Almost forever. And almost, in the long arc of history, is extraordinary. Not because it was flawless. But because it endured. Endurance is the true measure of psychological design. A single charismatic ruler can command fear. A single generation can build monuments. But sustaining belief across centuries requires something deeper than intimidation. It requires synchronization. Synchronization between environment and ideology. Between economy and myth. Between daily labor and cosmic narrative. Ancient Egypt achieved that synchronization along the rhythm of the Nile. The river flooded. The fields renewed. The people planted. The pharaoh performed ritual. Cycle reinforced cycle. Nature validated belief. When the flood arrived as expected, it felt like divine confirmation. And confirmation strengthens systems more effectively than force. But when the flood faltered, the tension surfaced. Because a system built on predictable harmony is vulnerable to unpredictability. The Nile did not always obey expectation. Low floods brought famine. High floods brought destruction. And in those moments, the divine narrative faced stress. A god-king cannot openly admit uncertainty. So explanations multiplied. More offerings. More prayers. More ceremonies. The response to instability was intensification. Which reveals something important. When belief systems feel threatened, they often grow louder rather than quieter. Silence signals doubt. Spectacle signals confidence. The later eras of Egypt shimmer with intensified symbolism. Elaborate tombs. Expanded temple complexes. Grand declarations carved deeper into stone. As if depth of inscription could reinforce depth of faith. But the more one must insist, the more fragility hides beneath. Still, the system did not shatter easily. Because it was not sustained only by elites. It lived in daily practice. In how families honored ancestors. In how artisans carved familiar symbols. In how stories passed from parent to child. The pharaoh was the apex. But the pyramid of belief was broad. And that breadth gave resilience. Even when central authority weakened, cultural memory endured. Even when foreign rulers took control, Egyptian ritual persisted. It adapted. Sometimes blending. Sometimes disguising itself. Sometimes reinterpreting old gods through new lenses. Power changed hands. But symbolism lingered. And that lingering is perhaps the most remarkable achievement. Many empires conquer. Few maintain psychological cohesion across millennia. The secret was not invincibility. It was integration. Religion was not separate from politics. Politics was not separate from agriculture. Agriculture was not separate from cosmology. Every element reinforced every other element. To pull one thread was to disturb the tapestry. But over centuries, threads loosened naturally. Trade routes expanded horizons. Foreign ideas entered ports. Younger generations observed alternatives. And exposure dilutes absolutism. If the world is larger than imagined, then your center is smaller than believed. That realization does not spark immediate rebellion. It sparks subtle reevaluation. And reevaluation is the quiet beginning of transformation. In time, Egyptian identity shifted from cosmic necessity to cultural heritage. The pharaoh became historical symbol rather than living axis of order. Temples became sacred sites rather than operational centers of state power. The language itself evolved, then faded from common use. Scripts once believed eternal required translation. Yet here we are. Still deciphering. Still examining. Still wondering. Which suggests something paradoxical. The original goal was permanence of authority. But what endured was permanence of curiosity. The pharaoh sought to be unquestioned. History ensured they would be endlessly questioned. And questioning is its own form of life. The dark psychology of ancient Egyptian power was not merely about controlling people. It was about controlling uncertainty. And in that effort, they revealed how deeply uncertainty shapes human behavior. We crave structure. We crave meaning. We crave assurance that chaos has boundaries. Egypt provided boundaries carved in stone. But even stone participates in time. What remains now is not control. It is testament. A testament to what humans can build when fear and imagination collaborate. Because fear alone produces paralysis. Imagination alone produces fantasy. Together, they produce civilization. The pharaoh stood at that intersection. Embodiment of fear managed. Embodiment of imagination formalized. Embodiment of continuity personified. It is tempting to judge ancient systems through modern lenses. To label them oppressive or mystical or naive. But doing so overlooks their sophistication. They constructed a psychological ecosystem calibrated to their environment. An environment of cycles. Of vulnerability. Of isolation and abundance intertwined. Their answer was elegant in its cohesion. And like all elegant systems, it contained its own limits. Too much centralization creates brittleness. Too much myth resists adaptation. Too much certainty suppresses innovation. Eventually, the weight of continuity slows evolution. And other civilizations, less anchored but more flexible, rise. That is not failure. It is transformation. Because no civilization is meant to last unchanged forever. But some are meant to leave imprints deep enough to influence everything that follows. Egypt is one of those. Its monuments still silhouette against desert horizons. Its symbols still decorate museums and imagination. Its stories still pulse in documentaries, novels, classrooms. The pharaoh is gone. But the archetype remains. The archetype of sacred authority. Of leader as stabilizer. Of power as cosmic necessity. And perhaps that is the final irony. The system designed to prevent chaos ultimately became part of history's vast, shifting tapestry. Absorbed. Reinterpreted. Studied. Admired. Critiqued. Not eternal in structure, but enduring in impact. Almost forever. And in the vastness of time, that is an extraordinary achievement. Because nothing truly escapes change. But some things change so slowly, so monumentally, that they feel like they have. And ancient Egypt, with its river and sun and stone, achieved that illusion better than almost any civilization before or since. An illusion so powerful it still glows in our collective imagination. Almost eternal. Almost divine. Almost beyond time. Almost forever. And yet even that phrase carries a quiet confession. Almost admits the boundary. It acknowledges that eternity belongs to no empire, no ruler, no stone monument, only to time itself. Ancient Egypt understood time in ways that feel alien to us. Not as a straight line rushing forward, but as a cycle. A return. A renewal. The sun rises. The sun sets. The Nile floods. The Nile recedes. Life emerges. Life dissolves. And then, in some sacred way, it returns. This cyclical understanding shaped everything. It softened the terror of death. It strengthened the promise of order. It framed leadership not as temporary administration, but as participation in a cosmic rhythm. The pharaoh did not merely govern. He synchronized. He aligned the human world with celestial patterns. Temples mirrored constellations. Calendars mirrored floods. Ceremonies mirrored solar movement. To disrupt leadership was to disrupt rhythm. And rhythm, when broken, feels dangerous. But cycles conceal something subtle. They repeat, yet never identically. Each flood differs slightly. Each sunrise appears the same, yet occurs on a different day. Each ruler claims divine continuity, yet carries a different personality. Over centuries, those differences accumulate. And accumulation quietly reshapes identity. The old kingdom was not the new kingdom. The early divine aura was not the later ceremonial prestige. Continuity masked transformation. Which is perhaps why the illusion held so long. Change that disguises itself as repetition is easier to accept. If rituals remain recognizable, people tolerate structural shifts. If symbols endure, power can evolve beneath them. But symbols themselves eventually require reinterpretation. And reinterpretation marks the moment when sacred certainty becomes cultural memory. When later generations looked upon earlier pyramids, even they saw antiquity. They, too, felt nostalgia. They, too, wondered about the grandeur of ancestors. Which means Egypt experienced its own sense of distance from its origins. Even within its longevity, it contained eras of remembering. That realization reframes the idea of permanence. No civilization is static. Even those that appear timeless contain internal layers of forgetting and rediscovery. The dark psychology of Egyptian power thrived because it adapted without admitting adaptation. It allowed surface continuity to shield deeper evolution. But every adaptation leaves residue. A slight shift in theology. A subtle redistribution of authority. A pragmatic compromise with foreign influence. Over time, the sacred center loses exclusivity. When Alexander arrived centuries later, he did not abolish Egyptian religious structure. He stepped into it. Foreign rulers crowned as pharaoh. An extraordinary testament to narrative resilience. Yet also evidence that the original core had softened enough to accommodate outsiders. The divine role became transferable. And once divinity becomes transferable, it becomes symbolic rather than absolute. Symbolic authority can endure. But it no longer commands existential certainty. Eventually, larger imperial frameworks absorbed Egypt. Languages shifted. Religions changed. Temples closed. Yet the monuments remained. Silent. Watching. Weathering. And here is the final psychological layer. Monuments outlive belief. Stone does not require faith to stand. But standing stone invites interpretation. And interpretation reanimates memory. The pharaoh no longer commands. But the image commands curiosity. The tomb no longer protects a divine journey. But it protects a narrative. And narrative, unlike flesh, can resurrect endlessly. Each generation reconstructs ancient Egypt in its own image. Romanticized. Exoticized. Studied scientifically. Filmed dramatically. Imagined philosophically. The civilization that sought to control its meaning now exists in countless meanings. That is both loss and victory. Loss of singular narrative. Victory of perpetual relevance. The dark psychology was never purely oppressive. It was existential engineering. An attempt to design stability in a fragile world. And fragility is universal. We live with different technologies. Different political systems. Different cosmologies. But the underlying tension remains. How do we feel secure in a world that changes? How do we believe in order when unpredictability surrounds us? Ancient Egypt answered with divine kingship. Other eras answer with institutions. With constitutions. With markets. With ideologies. Each era builds its own pyramids, physical or conceptual. Each era believes its structure will endure. And each era eventually confronts time. But here is the comfort hidden within impermanence. Influence does not require eternity. A civilization need not exist forever to matter forever. Ancient Egypt ceased to rule. Yet it continues to shape imagination. That shaping is its afterlife. Perhaps more powerful than the one envisioned in its sacred texts. Because this afterlife requires no ritual. No offering. No priest. Only curiosity. And curiosity is difficult to extinguish. So the pharaoh achieved something unexpected. Not unending dominion. But unending fascination. And fascination is its own subtle form of immortality. We look at the pyramids and feel small. We imagine the scale of labor and feel awe. We contemplate the belief required to construct them and feel reflection. In that reflection, the system still functions. Not as command. But as mirror. A mirror showing what humans will build when they seek permanence. A mirror showing how fear and faith intertwine. A mirror showing that every claim of forever contains an almost. And maybe that is the most honest word of all. Almost eternal. Almost divine. Almost unbreakable. Almost forever. Because forever belongs only to time. But meaning belongs to us. And ancient Egypt, through gold and river and stone, carved meaning so deeply into history that even time could not erase it completely. Not eternal. But enduring enough to feel like it. And in the vast silence of the desert, that distinction barely matters. Almost forever. But now we must look at the cost. Because every system that promises stability extracts something in return. Ancient Egypt's promise of order required hierarchy. Clear layers. Clear roles. Clear boundaries. Clarity feels safe. But clarity can also confine. When identity is predetermined, farmer, scribe, priest, noble, mobility narrows. And when the pharaoh is divine, upward aspiration ends at the throne. There is no competing vision of ultimate authority. No rival myth that says, you, too, could stand at the center. Instead, the system offers something subtler. Belonging. You may never be pharaoh. But you are part of something eternal. For many, that trade is acceptable. Certainty over possibility. Stability over disruption. Meaning over autonomy. And in a world where famine or invasion could end everything overnight, that trade likely felt rational. The dark psychology is not cruelty alone. It is prioritization. The prioritization of cohesion over individuality. of continuity over experimentation, of harmony over dissent. And harmony, when sustained long enough, becomes identity. But identity anchored too tightly resists evolution. When neighboring civilizations innovated militarily or politically, Egypt sometimes responded slowly. Because slow systems are stable systems. And stable systems assume tomorrow will resemble yesterday. When tomorrow does not resemble yesterday, adaptation must accelerate. Acceleration strains traditions. It tests myths. It forces reinterpretation. And reinterpretation can feel like betrayal. So leaders must choose. Protect the narrative or protect survival. Sometimes they managed both. Sometimes they could not. But the real brilliance of ancient Egypt lies not only in its monuments or longevity. It lies in how completely it understood psychological alignment. The average person's daily effort was linked to cosmic significance. That linkage is powerful. Modern societies struggle with fragmentation. Work feels disconnected from purpose. Institutions feel abstract. Authority feels distant. Egypt reduced distance. The divine lived in your city. The temple stood near your fields. The rituals were visible. The story was unified. Unity reduces anxiety. Fragmentation increases it. Yet unity requires control over narrative. And control over narrative requires boundaries around thought. Not necessarily through force. But through saturation. When every wall is inscribed. When every ceremony repeats the same message. When every festival reinforces divine kingship. Alternative frameworks struggle to emerge. Not because they are violently crushed every time. But because imagination is already occupied. Occupied by a complete explanation of reality. And complete explanations are comforting. They remove ambiguity. They tell you who you are. Where you fit. Why events happen. How death resolves. Ambiguity is heavy. Certainty is light. Even if that certainty is constructed. But no constructed certainty is immune to time. Gradually, trade networks widened. Ideas traveled. Military threats increased. Climate patterns shifted. And with each shift, the narrative required adjustment. Small adjustments are manageable. Large adjustments threaten cohesion.